Arthur Finch's world was one of cold logic and calculated acquisitions. As he left his office on a rainy November evening, a sound cut through the city's drone. A homeless little girl, huddled in an alcove, was humming a quiet, intricate melody. For anyone else, it was nothing. For Arthur, it was a system crash. The song was a secret, known only to him and his mother, dead for 40 years. He froze, the rain soaking his suit, his entire empire brought to a dead stop by the ghost of a lullaby on a forgotten street corner.
This is TS Simple Serene Stories. Before we get back to this touching story, I have a quick question for you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you believe that humanity and miracles are eternal, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Now, let's get back to the story.
Part 1, The Fortress of Solitude. Arthur Finch, at 52, measured his life in quarterly earnings and hostile takeovers. His world was a fortress of sterile glass and polished steel, meticulously designed to keep out the messy, unpredictable chaos of human emotion. He was a man of precision and brutal efficiency, and his heart was the most heavily fortified room in the entire structure. The foundation of this fortress was laid 40 years ago, cemented with the death of his mother, Eleanor. It was not a memory he had amputated, as a surgeon might a gangrenous limb. It was something far worse, a memory he had buried alive. At 12, he had been a brilliant, self-absorbed boy, already lost in the clean logic of the programming that would one day build his empire. Her illness had been an unwelcome distraction, a disruption to his code. The guilt from that time was a thing he had refused to acknowledge, encasing it in decades of work and rationalization. The lullaby she used to hum, a sound he hadn't consciously recalled since, lay dormant in that tomb, waiting. On a cold, rainy November evening, he was leaving a tense meeting. The acquisition was complete. A portfolio of dilapidated properties was now his. Among them, a long-defunct building called the Willow Creek Hospice, a name he registered with a flicker of detached annoyance. Another asset to be stripped, another line item. His route home took him through a neighborhood he hadn't visited in years, a place of crumbling brownstones his mother had once loved. Huddled in the damp, shadowy alcove of a shuttered storefront was Alara. At 9 years old, she was a ghost in the city's machinery, invisible to the powerful men striding past. Her eyes, wary and far too intelligent for her small face, watched the world with a quiet resilience. She clutched a threadbare rabbit to her chest, its button eyes staring blankly into the rain. To ward off the gnawing cold and the ache of loneliness, she did the only thing she could. She began to hum. It was a quiet, complex melody she knew only as Mama's song. As Arthur passed, the notes cut through the city's drone. It wasn't a conscious memory that surfaced, but a visceral, physiological reaction. His heart hammered against his ribs. The air grew thin. It was a key turning in a lock he had forgotten existed. A sound that bypassed 40 years of emotional suppression. It was a simple, unique tune his mother had composed just for him. It was their secret. The impossibility of hearing it here now from this child was a crack in the very foundation of his meticulously ordered world. Part 2. The Crack in the Wall. Arthur Finch froze. The rain continued its relentless assault, soaking the shoulders of his cashmere coat, but he didn't feel it. His chauffeur, Thomas, took a half step forward, his expression baffled. "Sir, is everything all right?" But Arthur didn't hear him. This wasn't compassion. It was a system crash. His mind, an instrument honed to process terabytes of data, and identify logical fallacies, had just encountered an impossible variable. The sound emanating from the small, shivering child was a piece of code from a dead server, a ghost in his machine. There was no emotional wave of pity. There was only the jarring, intolerable alarm of a paradox. This anomaly had to be quarantined, analyzed, and solved. He moved toward the alcove, his expensive leather shoes splashing through a grimy puddle. He crouched down, the movement stiff and unnatural, a betrayal of his own rigid posture. He was not a savior descending to help the needy. He was an investigator approaching a critical piece of evidence. His voice, when it came, was tight and strained, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. The song, where did you learn it? Elara flinched, pulling her threadbare rabbit tighter against her chest as if to shield it from him. She was used to being ignored, to being invisible. The sudden, intense focus of this powerful man was terrifying. But beneath the fear was a fierce, protective instinct. He was asking about her mother's song. It's my mother's song, she said, her small chin trembling, but her gaze steady. It's ours. The answer only deepened the logical chasm. Your mother? He pressed, his voice regaining some of its usual force, now fueled by a desperate need for data. What's her name? Where is she? Her name was Anna, Elara whispered, tears welling in her old eyes. She's an angel now. Anna. Eleanor. The impossibility intensified. The sight of her defiant grief didn't trigger a sudden transformation in Arthur. Instead, he made a cold, swift calculation. This child was the only lead. She was the single, inexplicable data point that held the key to debugging this mental crisis. To leave her here on the street would be to discard the only evidence, to allow the error to corrupt his entire system. He stood up, turning to his bewildered chauffeur. Get her in the car. Thomas hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide. Now, Thomas, Arthur commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. His motive was entirely selfish, rooted in a desperate need to restore order to his own mind. As he led the frightened child to the warmth of his waiting car, he wasn't taking her to a home. He was taking her to a secure corporate apartment, a clean, impersonal holding space where the anomaly could be contained. Part 3, The Unraveling. Arthur Finch was a terrible guardian. He treated Elara's presence not as a human responsibility, but as a logistical problem to be solved with capital. He had gourmet food delivered, which she eyed with suspicion before hiding bread rolls in her pockets. He bought her expensive clothes that remained in their boxes, and a tablet she ignored in favor of a simple notepad and pencil, on which she drew endless, heartbreakingly detailed pictures of a smiling woman with her own eyes. Their interactions were a series of miscalculations. He was baffled by her silence, her wariness. He didn't understand that the quiet, sterile luxury of the corporate apartment was as terrifying to her as the street was to him. Elara, in turn, was not just a grateful waif. She was grieving and disoriented, a small, resilient creature testing the bars of a new gilded cage. She would ask him questions that were like daggers to his ordered world. Did you have a mama? She asked once, her voice small, and Arthur had to physically leave the room. His first move was not to investigate Anna. That was a secondary problem. The primary anomaly was the song itself and the guilt it had unearthed. Driven by a gnawing need to confirm the facts of his own memory, he called Marcus Thorne, a private investigator whose discretion was as sharp as his intellect. I need you to investigate my mother's final days, Arthur said, his voice clipped, devoid of emotion. Her name was Eleanor Finch. I was told she died at St. Jude's Hospital 40 years ago. Confirm it. I want the full medical file, everything. A few days later, Thorne returned with the first bombshell. He laid a thin file on Arthur's vast mahogany desk. Your mother wasn't at St. Jude's when she passed, Arthur, Thorne said, his tone carefully neutral. The records show she was discharged at her own request. She transferred to a private care facility, the Willow Creek Hospice. The name struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. It was one of the properties in the portfolio he had just acquired for demolition. The irony was grotesque. He hadn't just been busy with his programming projects while she was dying. He had been willfully ignorant. He didn't even know where she was. The investigation pivoted, now fueled by Arthur's raw, burning guilt. Thorne focused his search on the hospice, digging through dusty archives. He found it, a series of extensive notes from a head nurse named Helen Carter. The notes detailed Eleanor's final weeks, her sharp wit, her grace, but also her profound sadness over her brilliant, distant son. She worried constantly that he was building walls around his heart, walls she would never be able to breach. Thorne, relentless, tracked down Helen Carter's family. Helen had passed away 5 years ago, but her daughter was alive, Anna Carter. The file on Anna told a tragic, brutally realistic story. She had followed her mother into nursing, a kind, competent professional. But her career had ended after a traumatic incident. The death of a child under her care left her with crippling PTSD. She lost her job. Her professional network, unable to cope with the depth of her trauma, fell away. She spiraled into a severe depression and eventually onto the streets with her own young daughter, Ilara. The final piece of the puzzle came from a reluctant interview with Anna's estranged sister. It was a family story, the woman said, her voice weary. My mom, Helen, never forgot that patient, Eleanor. She talked about her powerful love for her son and this little song Eleanor taught her. A message of hope, she called it. Anna loved that story. It was the only lullaby she ever sang to Ilara. Part 4, The Reckoning. Arthur sat in the profound silence of his office, the city lights glittering like cold, distant stars. The file from Thorne lay open on the vast expanse of his desk. He stared at the typed words, but he saw his mother's face. This was not a heartwarming story of a message in a bottle. It was an indictment. The lullaby was not a magical gift passed down for him to find. It was a dying mother's prayer, a testament to a powerful love he had been too arrogant, too busy, too self-absorbed to receive. It was a legacy of compassion passed from one kind stranger to another, a chain of empathy that he himself had broken. The fortress he had built around his heart didn't dissolve in a gentle wave of sentiment. It was shattered by a tsunami of shame. 40 years of calculated logic and emotional detachment were obliterated by a single, brutal truth. He hadn't just lost his mother. He had abandoned her. While he was chasing the clean perfection of code, she was in a hospice, alone, worrying about his soul. He had failed her in her final, most vulnerable moments. That was the real ghost that had haunted his life, not her death, but his failure. Part 5, The Fragile Beginning. The story did not end with a perfect family formed overnight. It began with the slow, grinding machinery of bureaucracy. Arthur started the long, complicated legal process of becoming Ilara's guardian. A world of social workers, evaluations, and probing questions for which his wealth was no shield. His transformation was not a sudden epiphany, but a daily conscious effort, often marked by clumsy failures. He would try to connect with Ilara, only to default to his cold, transactional nature. offering solutions instead of comfort. Ilara's healing was just as tentative. She slowly began to trust him, but the trauma of her past lingered in nightmares that left her screaming, and a grief for her mother that was a palpable presence in every room. Stability was a foreign language she was struggling to learn. Weeks later, Arthur sat awkwardly on the floor of Ilara's new room, a space filled with soft colors he'd been told were calming. He was trying to help her with a drawing, but his hands felt large and useless. She looked up at him, her gaze holding the same wary intelligence he'd first seen in the rainy alcove. "You're not very good at this," she observed, not unkindly. A short, unpracticed laugh escaped him. "No," he admitted, his voice rough. "I'm not." He fell silent and began to hum softly, the lullaby. Ilara didn't look up from her paper, but a moment later, she picked up her crayon and, almost inaudibly, began to hum along with him. It was not a resolution. It was not a happy ending. It was a single, fragile note of a new song, a quiet, uncertain start on the long road to healing. On the desk in his study, the Finch Foundation was merely an idea. 2 words scribbled on a notepad, a future goal, not a present reality.
Thank you for taking a quiet moment with us. Every story is a journey, and we're so glad you joined us for this one.
We believe stories are a way to connect, even when we're apart. If you felt a connection to this tale, we invite you to subscribe and become part of our growing circle.
Our question for you today is, what's a simple moment of peace you've experienced this week?
Share it in the comments. Let's fill this space with serene moments.
Until the next story, be well.